Welcome to this edition of our dialogues on and with China. Today, the topic that we have chosen is to look at geopolitical constellations through the lens of climate change. We all know that climate change is probably one of the most pressing problems, challenges confronting humanity. It also seems that the technological competition, which is very much part of the competition for world influence, is happening to a large degree also in the area of climate change or the connected energy transition. And the relationship between the United States and China, the United States and Europe, China and Europe, are very important for climate change. And Russia, of course, is a key factor, a key player in this constellation. So we're going to look at some of these issues and hopefully draw out some interesting insights for you all. Thank you for joining us. I'm very happy to welcome for this conversation a very distinguished panel. First and foremost, we have with us Alex Zhang. He is Executive Director of the EcoForum Global, and he joins us live from Beijing. And in Beijing, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. So I think there is a lot of dedication just in the fact of being part of this panel. I'm very happy to welcome Velina Tchakarova. She's the director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Studies. And I'm also very happy to welcome Professor Nebojša Nakićenović. He is Professor Emeritus at the Vienna University of Technology. He was, until very recently, the Deputy Director General of IIASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. And he's currently also, now let me see whether I get this right, the Deputy Chairperson of the Chief Scientific Advisors to the European Commission, which is a very distinguished panel of eminent experts. He has also worked with the IPC, the International Panel on Climate Change, in many occasions. So he's certainly our most eminent expert here on climate change itself. And with that, I think I would like to already ask Professor Nakićenović to kick us off a little bit with his analysis, insights, main takeaways from the state of climate policy based on the outcomes of the Glasgow Conference of the Parties, but of course on any other insights that you want to play. Please, Naki, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. And I would, of course, like to also thank the Bruno Kreisky Forum for the opportunity to participate in, I think, what promises to be a very exciting discussion. And I think that the title is really, really well chosen, whether the climate change will be a preferred area for global competition. And I think one can put a question mark after that statement. And I would arguably, I would like to argue that I think we are in some ways at crossroads. And I think there are two meanings of the global competition in the climate and other areas. The first one is that it can be a source of friction, of conflicts, of my country first logic. So that would, I would say, relatively negative connotation of the competition. But there is also an extremely positive connotation of this competition, and that is that we will promote evolution of the best ideas. And in that sense, our diversity across the world is a very important rich factor also of resilience, of resulting in new ideas how to combat climate change, but also other problems. And this is why I wanted to start with this brief cartoon here that kind of illustrates that the world, in addition to the current difficulties that we have in geopolitics, there are also major challenges facing humanity. I mean, there is the immediate threat of COVID-19 that we are all experiencing now with the new wave again of the infection. Climate crisis is another one, digital revolution. And what I would like to highlight is actually the confluence of these challenges, and also to argue that they need to be resolved simultaneously because there could be synergies in trying to deal with all of them. And we have to do that in the world that is also compounded by injustice, inequality, and ever increasing pressure on the earth systems. And I would like to highlight that. Climate is only one of them. We have the oceans, we have the biodiversity and so on. And without the integrity of the earth systems, our very survival on the planet is endangered. So I think in some ways we have to see this competition in the context of also trying to reach safe and just future for all. Can I have the next slide, please? So in that context, I would like to illustrate to you the magnitude of the challenge in the climate area, and hopefully that will also provide opportunities for positive, not just negative competition dimensions. This slide I called the carbon law. A few years ago, we published a paper in Science saying that there is a carbon law, and that has been now confirmed also by the IPCC and in many other publications. What you see here, just very briefly, is global emissions, fossil energy emissions of carbon dioxide. We emit today about 40 billion tons of carbon. And the carbon law basically implies that we need to halve the emissions every decade if the world is going to stabilize climate at about 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial level. So that's a must, and therefore this context of a law. And in the gray area, you can see these are the carbon emissions from energy. The brown sliver are the carbon emissions from the land use and the earth systems. But the problem is really compounded with huge challenges. And I would argue that we need really heroic effort or Herculean effort to achieve these goals. Because if you look the area that's green and blue, this is the contribution of the earth systems in reducing the emissions. So the planet Earth is kind to us. It absorbs about half of the emissions that we produce. But this is under the danger of being eroded. And it has to be enhanced, and that's the orange and yellow area, with so-called net negative emissions. Even if we halve every decade global emissions, we will still, in the second half of the century, need to generate net negative emissions. I think that, so to say, the most attractive are so-called nature-based solutions, which is afforestation and sustainable agriculture, but also carbon capture and storage, for example, in combination with sustainable forestry and plantations. These are the possibilities. So you see that the challenge is really huge, and unfortunately, emissions are increasing in the world. We are not even at the maximum. So we have another 8 years to basically halve the emissions worldwide. So that's an unbelievably high challenge. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is why the expectations 2 months ago of the Glasgow summit of the Conference of the Parties to the Climate Convention were really, really high. Expectations are high, and many people, observers, think that not enough was achieved. I would argue that a lot was achieved. Not enough, I would agree with that as well, but a lot. And I think this is important. There is a positive symbol. First of all, in agreement with the carbon law, the countries have agreed to cut the emission jointly by 45% by 2030 in order to keep 1.5 degree goal in sight. So I think this is very positive, a quantitative commitment of all of the countries. Europe, in its Fit for 55, actually strives for a 55% reduction by 2030, but China also has very ambitious goals, and many other countries. Now, important thing that was very controversial was the phase down of unabated coal. Many had wanted to see this as complete phase down of all of the coal by the middle of the century. I think that still needs to be the goal because coal is the major source of greenhouse gas and carbon emissions, but at least we are taking the first step. And if I'm not mistaken, China has, for example, agreed not to export any coal power plants anymore. A huge significant step. Then carbon credits across the borders. I think that's very important. And I think this will require a huge effort to return this year in 22 with new, much more ambitious nationally determined commitments, because the process is a bottom-up process. Countries commit themselves, and there was an agreement that they should be followed by annual updates from now on. And then in the following 4 bullets, let me just conclude with some of the highlights. I think was a really important step forward is that US and China, that are the 2 largest emitters, just that you have an impression, China emits about 40% of global emissions, US about 12–13%. That the largest emitters have agreed to work together, despite many recent rifts between the 2 countries, work together on the reduction. And I think this is a huge step forward. As you know, Europe, and that's in the next bullet, Europe wants to be the first carbon-free, climate-neutral continent with its Fit for 55 objective. President Putin of Russia has also declared carbon neutrality by 2050. So there are many countries, Japan as well, Europe, US. China has committed to climate neutrality, net zero emissions by 2060, and significantly, I think many were surprised, India by 2070. And you know, I think this effort that's required cannot be underestimated, because both in China and in India, emissions are increasing at quite a high rate, globally about 5%. But in US and Europe, the emissions have been relatively flat during the last decades and declining. And then over 100 nations have agreed on a 30% cut in the emissions of methane, the second strongest greenhouse gas. So that's also very significant, because we can expect also with the melting of the permafrost in the far north that methane emissions will increase in the future. And then also finances. I think one of the big disappointments was the promise of 100 billion per year for the developing countries is not yet really done, so to say, but financial institutions are committing to change their portfolios in the direction of net zero by 2050. So there is lots of movement. I want to conclude here my brief introduction, and just by observing that I think this needs to be an inclusive process. It is really about all of us. It's about our collective actions. Governments have to take the steps in steering the process in the right direction, but we all have to act. So it's also about our behaviors, institutions, and our collective action. So Irene, I will stop here. I hope I've not overconsumed the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Nakićenović. Thank you for a fascinating and very precise and concise glimpse into the world of climate change negotiations and the state of play there. One of the things you have mentioned is the decision of China and the US to work together on climate change. Very interesting declaration that came out in Glasgow, not just to work together in general, but also in very specific, you know, for example, on making the energy transition also socially just, and highlighting the importance of methane, for example, as one of the areas for future cooperation. Let me turn to you, Alex, and ask you from the perspective of your country, how would you go at this question that we have at the core of our discussion here? You know, how climate change can be an area of cooperation and competition at the same time, possibly. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lady Ambassador. Thank you, Kresge Forum. I think I agree with Professor Nakićenović. I think it's a very important and interesting topic organized especially at the beginning of this year of 2022. While many of us was expecting a much better year of 2021, but with the unpredictable of the pandemic, the 2021 was another challenging year for most human beings living on this planet. But I also like the phrase, I think nothing is perfect without a crack. The crack is where the lights come in. So we now moving to a new year with hope that I think the last November's Glasgow, last October's Kunming CBD COP15 Phase 1, and also last September's IUCN WCC, though the outcomes are debatable at many levels, but I think everybody of us on this panel should also continue our work, especially on the global collaboration. And I also like Lady Ambassador's introduction with a focus on technology, renovations, disruptive innovations, should bring us, all human beings, reaching the targets, whether it's SDG 2030 or as the Paris Accord 2015 that we have set for ourselves. As the drill I've seen, I shall give a very short introduction of the organization, the Eco Foundation Global, where we come based in China, as the Lady Chair has introduced. We organize one of China's probably the so-called national level international platform called Eco Forum Global since 2009. From 2009 to 2012 is a time of us growing out from southwest part of China called the Guizhou province. Different from the east coast of provinces or cities at Beijing, Shanghai, Canton, or Hong Kong that many of you already know. Guizhou, Guiyang city is probably one of the least developed city and the province in China, southwest part. But as we see, I personally call when we enter into the new decades of 2010 or 2020, we enter into a period I call the environmental enlightening period. So even in such least developed province, we are extremely pleased that the provincial and the city government since 2009 has put in tremendous resources in organizing this international platform. And from the very beginning, we're working with UNEP, UNESCO, UNDP, many of UN agencies, as well as international sovereign powers, UK, Germany, many European countries, North America, and so on. And the major change, as most of you probably noticed, starting from the end of 2012, when the so-called the China's Communist Party's number 18 Congress was held, when President Xi Jinping and the administration was took in the office, we really put eco-civilization, which for those of you has some knowledge, it is very similar to the SDG goals introduced by the UN system, but it's also with a strong focus with Chinese Eastern culture, Chinese philosophy input. We trying to look at climate, biodiversity, environment issues in general in a whole. So we trying to adopt a holistic approach to solving these challenges while facing by all of us with no boundaries of border or religions or language or culture or the different developing status of countries and so on. I think, personally, I think this trend we also sort of observing recently towards the end of Glasgow, where you see there is a movement, ideas being raised, whether these conventions, whether it's UNFCCC or CBD or Ramsar, or these conventions should be considered a possibility of merging them, because we are really facing these challenges together. And in the past 20 or 40 years, unfortunately, though these conventions or these setting different targets over decades and so on, but unfortunately, most of these targets has been failed. And while some group of most influential policymakers, smartest scientists, and many capable peoples has invested, demonstrated very strong wills and invested lots of resources into these challenges. But unfortunately, these targets and goals are failed. And we have seen the extreme weathers or faster space of losing of biodiversities getting severe and severe. So in short, we are not seeing these challenges are being reduced. Otherwise, it's actually getting severe and severe. And I think when the Chinese government introducing the eco-civilization concept from the year of 2007, but really taking the speed since beginning of 2013, where when our Irene, you are in China as ambassador of Austrian to China, you have experienced from the party's 18th Congress towards 19th Congress, in particularly when China changing its positions significantly in 2015, not only in that September adopted SDG 2030, but more importantly, totally changing its position from Copenhagen to Paris, become a major contributor to the Paris Accord. These are some fundamental changes, but let me going back to more related to today's topic, as you have suggested. I would like to give a quick update about China's climate and carbon policies in the past year or so. As you all know, China's President Xi Jinping has announced our carbon neutrality targets in September of 2020 at the UN Assembly. It's a set in motion a massive buildup of national policies, legislation and regulations on decarbonization with unprecedented speed, which means, we short in China, we call it 30-60, which means by 2030, we will peak our carbon emission, and by 2060, we'll try to neutralize our carbon emission. While we say it's unprecedented speed, because if we look at all the developed countries and the developing countries, if China can peak its carbon emission by 2030. It's only less than 10 years. It's the fastest speed we have ever seen in the human being's histories. Likewise, towards our 2060 goal of neutralizing our carbon speed. And following that, in the March of 2021, in our so-called every year's People's Congress in every March, there was a significantly, the China's People's Congress has passed China's 15th five-year plan with a whole host of climate and energy targets for 2025. And I think there are four key elements of these 5 years, 14th five-year plan towards the climate and energy targets. Number one is reduce carbon intensity by 18% from 2020 levels. Number two is reduce energy intensity by 13.5% from 2020 levels. Number three is increase the forest coverage to 24.1%. Number five is increase the share of non-fossil sources in the energy mix to around 20%. So as I don't know if you compare this with developed countries when they were climbing the ladder of industrialization and the urbanization process. In the meantime, trying to reduce its carbon emission, how you will judge these four targets we set in 5 years' time from 5 years' time from 2020 to 2025. But from Chinese point of view, we think it's quite ambitious targets, and it will require a lot of policies and investment, including what Irene and Professor Nakićenović has also mentioned, fundamental changes on the civil society level as well. So by then, around July of 2021, I think in preparation towards Glasgow, while you also see U.S. Special Envoy of Climate John Kerry visited China twice, followed by COP 2016's Chairman Alok Sharma visiting China. By about July's time, basically, China has introduced a so-called 1+N policy framework, trying to break down the big targets of the 2030 and the 2060 into the one stands for a top level guiding opinions, which is at the central level, party level, whole nation kind of thing. And the N refers to a set of more than 30 sector-specific decarbonization plans. Yeah. Though we say we trying to adopt in the market economy, but as you also know, China's NDRC, National Development and Reform Committee, has a very strong power in setting these 5 years plan and so on. So we're trying to break down the targets into these 30 sector specific decarbonization plans. And I hope the 14th 5 years plan will just be as successful as the previous 13th 5 years plan, so that if we can following these planned economy way, by 2025, we can reach those targets. But unfortunately, as we are seeing somewhat towards the end of 2021 in European countries caused by the energy or natural gas crisis. In the summer towards fall, early autumn time in China, we also experiencing a great shortage of electricity in China. Some part because of big climate crisis, like huge rains in Henan province, and in the early autumn, even in the large coal-making, producing province like Shanxi, which has never been experienced since we have the climate record caused by the climate change. But also because of the pandemic makes China's export boosting its all capacities. So we experience a shortage of electricity. So in domestically, around that period of time, from July, I would say almost towards October, there is a huge debate domestically about energy security of China. While we have adopted and promised to the world about reducing the carbon, reducing the coal usage, trying to switch into a more sustainable, clean, renewable, green energy supply. But in the meantime, we have to accept the fact that for such big countries, the government has the responsibility for feeding 1.4 billion people's stomachs. The security of energy becomes a very important issue for the top policy makers. So unfortunately, as we have also seen recently, as EU commissions trying to come up with new regulations accepting some kind of fossil fuel or nuclear energies, similar policies was introduced in August, in September. Some have already closed down. Small coal mining sites are being reopened. And some of the new coal mining, coal-based electricity plants are being approved to be built. I think that's just the reality we have faced in China. And we also sort of trying to see how it's moving forward on the EU policy, caused by the current natural gas crisis in EU, many UK included countries as well. And I think these are also the challenges that all countries in the world are facing in the coming years. Now, we talked so much in Glasgow, and we also extremely happy to see US and China has that joint declaration of enhancing the climate cooperation in 2020s. But when we're facing these realities, the alarms come again that we cannot count on ambitious goals. That's why I think around the Glasgow time and also after Glasgow, Chinese policymakers, scholars, and so on, we trying to cool down, we trying to reduce the expectation from the international societies as well as from some of the domestic scholars and so on. We have to facing the realities. We have to, for China as a responsible large country in the world, we have to find our energy policies that we can adopt safely in the coming years. I think our promised world 2030 and 2060 are still there. And we didn't commit to 2025 peaking as UK, US, many Western countries are expecting China to announce an even more ambitious goal in Glasgow. We unfortunately didn't announce that. I think it was caused by the reasons I have mentioned. Yeah. Now our government, scholars, and all societies are trying to focusing on how we can really deliver the 2030 and the 2060 goals.
Thank you.
So, ladies Ambassador, I'm to closing at here. Yes.
Thank you so much. It was fascinating to listen to you. And I think it was also good that you reminded us about the significant leadership that China has taken on global environmental issues, by hosting the Kunming conference of the parties on the Convention of Biological Diversity, and also through the chairmanship, the presidency of Minister Zhang at the IUCN for such a long time. He's also called Zhang, has no relationship with you, Zhang Xuetong, who did an extraordinary work there at the IUCN and mobilized a lot of support also for the IUCN in China. And hopefully in a later a moment of our conversation, we will also be able to speak perhaps about some of the other work that is being done on coastal management and so forth. But for now, thank you very much for giving us this very detailed and also very honest report about where China stands at this time on climate change. Before turning to our third distinguished panelists, I would like to turn to our public and invite our participants in the public to send in any questions they might have through the chat. We can come back to these questions, and we will come back to these questions in a later stage of our program. But please start thinking about what you would like to say to our distinguished panelists, what you would like to ask them. We will gather those questions and make sure that we can have an interactive conversation later on today. At this point, please, Velina, I would like to ask you to come in and give us your introductory remarks.
Thank you very much. And also thank you for the excellent remarks by the distinguished colleagues. Today, I'm in the role of presenting the Russian view on climate change and respectively the Russian approach. And I argue that Russia currently sees itself as both a big winner and also big loser of the global energy transition. And I will explain with concrete cases and information why. Now, first, according to a study, a comprehensive study by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Russia is warming 2.5 times faster than the rest of the world. And in reality, just a few years ago, some regions across Russia were already experiencing the hottest temperatures on record, contributing particularly to forest fires and also a lot of droughts and other natural disasters. And there was even the example from 2020 when the forest fires that burned through Russia amounted to the acreage of the size of Greece, and in fact emitted 1/3 more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than in 2019, just a year just the previous year. Also, flash floods is another example. The flash floods in Siberia destroyed villages, displaced thousands of residents. And finally, an example of the snow coverage, which was at a record low once again in 2020, and Arctic sea ice coverage shrank to its second lowest extent in over 40 years. Now, these are just a few examples that make a point. So logically, President Vladimir Putin admitted that it was impossible to deny climate change when disasters had become almost a norm. Acknowledging the reality and the hazards of climate change is in fact a big change for Russia's leader and also for the future orientation of Russia's geopolitics. And this happened just in the recent years ahead also of the Glasgow conference. So in a sense, this is definitely a good news. This is a big breakthrough in the Russian official narrative. Second is, of course, the energy portfolio and how important it is for Russia. Now, Russia was world's biggest combined gas and oil exporter in 2020. So if you take, of course, separately gas and oil exports into consideration, and then you take the sum of it, Russia is definitely ranking number one. And therefore, it is the country with the most to lose from a global energy transition, a factor that is often overlooked in current geopolitical events, but we should also regard when we try to analyze future Russian actions. So currently, Russia is the world's fourth largest emitter of greenhouse gases, pumping out 5% of the world's carbon. It is also a significant source of methane emissions, often also coming from creaky gas pipelines, and Russia has plenty of it. Plenty of them, of course. So climate change undoubtedly poses a lot of risks for Russia, as this upsurge in wildfires, melting permafrost across Siberia in the recent years have shown, affecting not only the life of citizens, but also the Russian infrastructure, the energy pipelines, and thus, of course, the need for the Russian stakeholders to act accordingly. So, as I said, in the previous years, the Kremlin has tended to downplay climate change related risks, and if anything, highlight rather the potential pluses a warming climate might offer Russia. Climate change has never been a kind of a major domestic issue publicly, at least, as I said, during the previous years and prior to the Glasgow conference. So yet Russia only ratified the Paris Agreement in 2019, basically 4 years after its conclusion. And its nationally determined contribution launched in November 2020 was a kind of a modest effort rather than actually an ambitious attempt. And yet we have to register it at least on the list of concrete actions by Russia. So Russia committed to reduce carbon emissions by 2030 to 70% of the 1990s levels, which is rather a soft target given substantial post-Soviet era deindustrialization. And the government's energy strategy 2035 was also envisaging a kind of continued expansion of fossil fuel production, while renewable energy and energy efficiency ambitions don't really go far enough for the moment. So, as I said, fossil fuels will still remain largely on the agenda, and specifically, of course, natural gas and liquefied natural gas. So in the annual State of Nation speech in April last year, Russian President Putin declared that Russia's total net greenhouse gas emissions should be less than the European Union's over the next 30 years, describing this goal, of course, as tough, but still realistic. So this was the first time when the year of 2050 was basically given as a reference. There is a draft climate strategy that is currently being under discussion among Russian government agencies, but is not formally adopted yet. And this climate strategy describes the Russian plans to cut carbon emissions by almost 80% by 2050. Of course, to meet this target, it would mean a set of very ambitious goals, and it's still questionable whether it's realistic to be considered. And of course, finally, what is also important, because it was already mentioned by my Chinese colleague, addressing an energy conference in Moscow in early October last year, Russian President Putin confirmed also and committed officially that Russia would be achieving zero net carbon emissions by 2060. So we see also that Russia is clearly orienting itself towards the Chinese goals, when it comes to zero net carbon emissions, rather than those of the European Union. Now, in part, Russia's should I stop here? Or?
No, please, please.
Okay. So in part, Russia's shift on climate change mitigation is a kind of, as we see, a response to rather external pressures. And of course, the need to also adapt certain policies, but also the need to adapt to certain economic pressures. And of course, it is a reflection of the global efforts to reduce emissions and diversify energy supplies away from fossil fuels, which of course, from a Russian view, represent a serious and long-term threat, specifically, of course, when it comes to oil, not so much when it comes to natural gas. And in this case, the European Union's plan to levy a carbon border tax on imports from states that aren't doing enough to reduce greenhouse gas emissions jeopardizes clearly Russian exports. Europe takes 45% of Russian exports, of course, mainly oil, gas, steel, coal, and metals and fertilizers. So this definitely will hit Russia badly. But then again, there are some incentives to reduce the carbon intensity of the Russian economy. And this is at least another positive sign, so to say, which is being reflected currently by Russian decision makers. And of course, when we talk about Russia, hydrocarbons, oil, gas, and coal play an outsized role in the Russian government, in the Russian strategies, and of course, Russian economy. Nearly 90% of Russia's energy comes from carbon-heavy sources, while oil and gas provide over 35% of government revenue. So it's going to be a very tough goal also internally, domestically, to achieve a shift, a mind shift, so to say. And there is also the social dimension of the process. Big parts of the country are dependent on oil, gas, and coal extraction to provide revenues and jobs. However, according to current polls in Russia, there is actually big support for climate change related activities, and also there is the understanding that climate change represents a big threat, one that is being even bigger than wars or terrorism. So as I said, there is a downside and an upside, and Russia continues to see opportunities in a warming climate, also both economically and geopolitically, and we have to also consider this side of the story. So in a sense, Russia leverages its leading role in global energy flows to increase also its geopolitical influence, as we have been observing this to some extent in Europe's gas supply crisis from last year, which is continuing in 2022. And of course, this argument gives us some reason to be skeptical of Russian true intentions and the credibility of the latest climate pledges. So the vital importance of fossil fuels needs to be stressed when we try to analyze the Russian approach to climate change. And in a sense, specifically when it comes to expanding agricultural production in Siberia and the Far East, opening up greater access to energy and mineral resources in Arctic regions of northern Russia, and facilitating expansion of shipping along the northern sea route between Asia and Europe. This will be some of the areas where Russia also sees actually a kind of overlapping of interests with China in the future. So in a sense, there is also a geopolitical thinking behind it. And I would stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Velina. Thank you for a very interesting perspective also that you brought to our conversation. Now, we see from all the statements, we saw the challenges that climate change policy brings to these to the nations that we discussed. Obviously also to the European Union, which has been in the forefront of setting goals and setting quite ambitious goals for itself. The European Union also being the only major economy so far that has managed to decouple economic growth from the growth in CO2 emissions. And we have a question in the chat also that I want to weave into the conversation now. With all these challenges, is it realistic to speak about the major decrease in CO2 emissions that we need, according to your slide, Professor Nakićenović, according to the targets that were set, and really to twist the question around a little bit more, because that was part of my initial thinking on this topic. Is it not also a major advantage if an economy moves early on climate change? Is it not an advantage in the competition, in the global competition? Is it not a boost to innovation and to societal change also? Can I give the question to you, Naki, to try to work on it a bit from that angle, and you know, looking at the different actors that we discussed, US, China, you brought in India, you know, I mean, what is there to gain for these countries? Because they're not going to make these major changes on climate policy just to please other countries. I mean, that's not the point. But I believe there is something to be gained for each country domestically, very, very significantly, no?
Yeah, well, let me argue that I think that the challenge of radical reduction of emissions and responding to the climate change threat, but also other global threats that I mentioned at the beginning, I think, is there to bring the benefit to all, to bring the benefit to people. And I would argue that we have a paradox here. On one side, for the last 40 years, science has been quite clear on the big picture, where we are landed today. We now have warmed the climate over 1 degree above the pre-industrial levels, about 1.1 degrees. And perhaps this is not clear to everybody, but by 2040, because of the inertia in the system, we will exceed 1.5. We will not stay under 1.5. In any case, no matter what's done, we'll exceed 1.5. And if strategies that we have been just discussing, that important countries in the world, but also the rest of the world, we didn't talk about Japan and many other countries that also have strategies of reduction. All of those strategies would then help us thereafter try to reduce the biggest risks of climate change. In other words, the risk will continue increasing, and both of our speakers have alluded to the difficulties we already had last year. I mean, it is really visible that the extreme events and many other phenomena changed by climate are already here. And I think the increased awareness, as I said, science has been clear for many decades, but the increased awareness that we need to do something about it has to do with the fact that we have already in many ways crossed the red line. And, the north latitudes like Siberia and Russia in general, the polar regions in any case are warming twice as fast as the world. So there we have over 2 degrees warming, but in Austria as well, perhaps that's not so well known. Austria is also 2 degrees warming already. And so even 1.5 target, that means by 2040, we will have about 3 degrees increase in many of those parts of the world. So I would argue that this is the paradox of the situation. On one side, I think we are losing the capacity of the Earth systems to provide for all of our existence. Agriculture, ecosystems will be threatened. This is not just the physical infrastructure. And when such extreme events happen, people who are affected the most are the ones who are most vulnerable. This is where the big risks come from the vulnerable part of the societies. So that's the other side of the paradox. We need the development. We need to bring development, even in Europe, that has one of the, I think, the most ambitious plans for reducing emissions to net zero by 2050. Even in Europe, we have estimated 30 to 50 million people who cannot pay energy. And that number is increasing as we speak because of the exploding energy prices. So I do call that a paradox. Now, to end on a positive note, 30 years is tough. I mean, it's a relatively short time on historical states. On the other hand, if you look back to 1990, a lot has been achieved in 30 years. So I think we do have metaphors from history that indicate that if there is a determined action, a lot can happen. In particular, because the way forward toward decarbonization, increasing electricity in the energy systems, more efficient use of limited resources, recycling, of reuse of materials, all of that has many co-benefits. And I think China is a great example of the co-benefits. The heavy dependence on coal, on fossil energy causes lots of air pollution, not just in China, around the world. All of the policies that would be good for reducing greenhouse gas emissions are also good for eliminating the air pollution. About 8 million people die prematurely in the world from the air pollution. So the co-benefits are huge, and I think it's a part of the development agenda. So in my view, I think this trying to achieve synergies between the two are the only way forward. Whether we'll be now managed to halve the emission in half a decade is an open question, but we know what to do. What we don't know, and I think this is more in the domain of governance and human behavior and culture, how to do it, I think is an open question. This is where the huge ambition is ahead of us. And I think everybody has to pull the cart. We are all here together. I don't think that the governments can do that themselves, no matter how determined they are. Private sector has to be there. Citizens have to be there. Let me just conclude my comment by saying we have published for the European Commission a scientific opinion with policy suggestions on energy just half a year ago in parallel to the Fit for 55 legislation package. And there we say that this strategy needs to be people-centered. To achieve these goals, we need a people-centered approach so that everybody sees what the benefits are. Otherwise, we will not achieve this huge ambition ahead of us.
One of the things that I witnessed personally when I was in China as Austria's ambassador between 2012 and 2017, was how important the environmental issues were to the middle class in China. And the middle class in China is big, several 100 million people, and it is growing, which is not the case in many other parts of the world. And this middle class is demanding better environmental conditions, and they are demanding it from their own government, which it's quite an active policy debate, I would say, that I witnessed at the time. So I think that may help the Chinese government at this point. And the other thing that impressed me quite a bit was the possibility and the willingness of the Chinese government to take a decision and give a clear direction. And then to allow all the actors, the many actors in the Chinese society and Chinese economy, to formulate and to think about how they can contribute towards implementing that goal and that direction. And I think that is something that is quite powerful. On the one hand, the government that sets a clear direction, and on the other side, a willingness of almost all sectors of society and all actors in an economy to then contribute to the goals set by the government. There is not, I don't see that as clearly in Austria, for example, or in some other countries that I know quite well. So in that sense, but I don't want to speak for China since we have a Chinese representative here on the panel. How do you see, Alex, the possibilities of actually achieving the changes? I mean, the Chinese economy is also restructuring significantly. I mean, there are many factors that point in the direction that the goals that the Chinese government sets can be achieved.
Well, thank you, Irene. And I think you are one of probably the renewable energy expert from Western countries, understand how China, the political system work the most. And you have very clearly pointed out that in a very centralized country like China, the one-party's government is very powerful in accumulating or concentrating all the powers that it can mobilize to achieve a target. That's why, although, as I said in the beginning, that the Glasgow probably is not the end of the climate challenges that we are facing, but we still very glad to see the progress has been made in Glasgow. If we back to the 2015, if you remember, I think before or during that time, US and China has all issued a national statement towards the Paris Accord, which I think was a very important milestones and was a very important factor that we reached Paris Accord 7 years ago. And this year, I think in Glasgow, people are quite surprised that US and China was able to have that joint declaration despite all the geopolitical and conflicts in many areas between the two countries. And another positive note as a Chinese I can see is also improvement from the China side is we accepted the so-called ambitious target of 1.5 degree instead of our strong position in Paris about 2 degree. And secondly, we are not the country had the issue with whether it's a phrase out or phrase down on the coal term of the Glasgow pact. So which means our government has also neutralized our view in terms of coal and other fossil energies. So I want to say is we should still keep hope about we are able to reach that target. But I think I want to refer to the importance of this dialogue. But I also want to expand a little bit, learning the lessons of how the human beings are fighting the pandemic that we are facing. We encountered in now about 2 years, and significant lessons we learned is if we are able to work out of pandemic, it's not only about China, US, EU, Japan, these big, powerful countries. It's really about whether the vaccines are able to be justly, fairly being distributed to everybody, every countries. So I think international collaborations among all countries, not only the largest emitter, whether the China as the largest developing countries or US as the largest developed countries, and I agree, Europe probably has the most ambitious climate target, regions. It's really, about all countries, all human beings. I saw in the chat rooms, there are another 2 billion peoples adding to this game by 2050. 70% of people are still living in developing countries. I mean, this is we all agreed if everybody want to living in US standard of life, or even today China's standard of life, where Earth is not enough. So the lessons we learned in fighting with pandemic can very much be applied also to the climate or biodiversities or other challenges that we are facing, that we really need the collaborations. And I'm very pleased to see, at least in these areas, China, US, Russia, European countries are able to work together, are able to making progress, though it's not as big as we hoped in Glasgow, but we're still making the progress forward. And talking about the middle class you mentioned, I also want to just to spare 1 minute to talk about this, the World Coastal Forum that we have just held in China early this week. First of all, this is not another initiative, a new initiative from China. It is a global call. The CMS, Convention on Migratory Species, has introduced its resolution in 2017 calling for establishing a global coastal forum, followed by CBD and Ramsar in 2018 and 19, and IUC and WCC in Marseille. So I think the importance of this is not only about the richness of ecosystems along the coastal areas, but also because within the 100 kilometers along the coastal lines inhabit about 50% of world population and 70% of GDP. And these are the areas, for example, in China, as you know very well, Irene, it's the coastal area has the strongest economic power. It's already the developed areas. So we want to build a new platform emphasizing on international cooperation and also with a special focus on action and implementations. We are not intend to develop into another conventions or another international NGOs or IOs. Mm-hmm. Fairly speaking, I think we have enough targets and goals for 2030 to 2050. What is missing, as I also see in the chats, is really actions being adopted in the real world. And as I said in my beginning introduction, I feel, and you also experienced and can testify, in China's political system, we don't need to debate its strengths and weakness, but at least when this system being mobilized, it can concentrate the power to deliver targets. When we holding the international advisory meeting of the first World Coastal Forum in the afternoon of January 10th, the CEO of WWT says 72 years ago, January 10th of 1946, United Nations being founded. And he finished her speech calling for a transformational change. I mean, all the panelists, including you, Chair, we all agree the past 4 decades are not the best time of human beings in fighting with the climate or biodiversity loss, all these challenges. We need innovative, disruptive innovation. We desperately looking for a transformational change. So the World Coastal Forum are being introduced, China trying to provide resources and platform, answering the calls from the conventions and IUCNs. We, of course, based on the international cooperation, we're trying to focusing on implementation and actions and trying to see if the richest area where the middle class are most centric, the coastal areas are able to achieve those climate or biodiversity targets, given these are also the most vulnerable areas being impacted by the climate change through the sea rising level and so on. These are the citizens constantly receiving the alarming calls already. So yes, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
No, you're taking an interesting tangent on the question, which brings out the importance of cooperation and cooperation for concrete results also. And I will latch on to that opportunity, of cooperation, and just ask the panelists, a bit, to reflect on the cooperation that exists currently. It seems that there is a fairly solid cooperation between the European Union and China on climate change, for example. For years, that has been a constant element of the EU-China relationship, which is a strategic relationship, which has its ups and downs, as any relationship, of course, but has been fairly stable. The EU, the China-US cooperation on climate change, I think we'll have to see what comes of it. It's quite new. It's quite interesting, because at the face of it, it goes against what you would expect, what I would expect at least, that there is fierce competition in this area, actually in the technological area and in some other areas. What about the cooperation between the European Union and Russia on energy and climate change? When you look at the documents, you see things like selective engagement with Russia in the area of climate change. And you also see a lot of emphasis put on resilience of the European Union. The European Union needs to be careful not to become even more dependent on Russia in energy issues. What do you make of that, Velina? And then I'll ask the other participants also to come in and say what they wish to say. And then as we slowly move toward the conclusion of this conversation.
It's not a secret that the relationship between the European Union and Russia has been troubled by the events in 2014, and following the annexation of Crimea, the relationship has basically entered a new phase of diplomatic isolation, sanctions policy. So given this isolation by the West, not just by the European Union, but also by the United States, of course, Russia is very suspicious when it comes to any kind of cooperation. However, there is indeed a European Union-Russia environmental dialogue. There is a formal environmental dialogue platform which has been initiated under the Common Space, was launched in 2006 with high-level meetings, and of course was held approximately every 2 years. There is, as we know, energy interdependence between Russia and the European Union member states, as Russia is the biggest provider of energy supplier for the European Union, specifically when it comes to gas. And this is why, of course, anything that the European Union has been actually launching as policies and as strategies and approaches, particularly from the last 2 years, are and will be affecting Russian interests and Russian approaches in the future. Bilaterally, the European Union and Russia have been cooperating on environmental questions and issues since the 1990s. So this is definitely one of the areas, even though it's being described as a soft issue, but it's definitely one of the areas which still can find a common ground. Similarly to what my Chinese colleague described also in the relations between the United States and China, where we know from the last few years how troublesome the relationship has become. However, the climate change related issues are at least one of these areas of common interest. And over the past 2 decades, the European Union has provided support for numerous projects aimed at improving environmental standards in Russia. Currently, the European Union is channeling its support to environmental actions through ongoing partnership initiatives, for instance, the cross-border cooperation, the Northern Dimension, and also other partnership instruments. And specifically, the Northern Dimension Environmental Partnership is a result-focused initiative which responds to calls from the international community, and in particular Russia, but also Belarus was benefiting from this initiative for concerted action to tackle the most pressing environmental problems and also to address some climate-related issues. And in the case of Russia, of course, one of the biggest fears is related to funding. As we know, these energy transition policies and actions will require a huge amount of funding, which Russia, contrary to the European Union and to China and the United States, cannot provide for to such extent. And that's why one of the incentives how to also bring Russia to the negotiation table, but also to make Russia introduce more climate actions oriented policy is actually by offering enough financial incentives. And one way, for instance, how the European Union has been doing it is, for instance, through the Northern Dimension Support Fund, which amounts to more than 360 million euro, with the European Union being the largest contributor of this fund. So in a sense, I see a lot of potential for at least this dimension of the bilateral relationship between the European Union and Russia. But as a geopolitical analyst, I need to stress once again that in fact the relationship is currently at its lowest point following the military escalation in eastern Ukraine, which is why I don't see really a big window of opportunity for any other important issues, such as the ones related to climate action for the moment, unless, of course, there is the escalation of the crisis. And basically, then, of course, one of the incentives would be to concentrate on important long-term oriented topics such as climate change and how to tackle it collectively and in a collaborative manner.
Mm. And as you're saying, the opportunities for cooperation with Russia on anything outside the peace and security agenda, very narrowly speaking, are very slim currently, but there has been increased cooperation between Russia and China on energy, traditional energy, electricity, exports from Russia to China also, and gas deliveries, obviously from Russia to China. But that's more in the area of conventional energy policy and collaboration, not necessarily moving into the direction of an energy transition, right? Alex, there's not so much with Russia in the area of climate change policy. Would you like to comment on that briefly?
Honestly speaking, I'm not a geopolitical researcher on these energy issues, but I just want to say, recently the riot we see in Kazakhstan, which caused a big alarming call about energy security in China, as that I think that whether it's natural gas and oil pipelines that are being built across the Central European countries through Kazakhstan probably counts for anywhere around 1/5 or even 1/4 of the main importing channel of the natural gas, supplying large parts of Western provinces, Northwestern provinces in China, as well as all the way down to Canton or Shanghai and so on. So, I mean, the conventional fossil fuel energy cooperation between Russia and China has quite a long history, as Velina has mentioned. I think since late 1980s or 1990s. It's not because of the tensions that we have seen almost a new Cold War in some terms. Some people say It's China's faster growing economy, and we need to find alternative energy supplies. And our neighboring countries has such, the natural resources. So it makes a lot of sense. But the current situation in Central Asian countries also caused some good debate in China about we need to have more alternative sources, while in the meantime, also I think emphasizing on the renewable, sustainable green energies that we can supply into our system.
Yeah. Clearly, the challenges are not just in terms of the size of the change that is needed to address climate change, but also the web of relations between those big actors is quite a complicated one. Let me turn to Professor Nakićenović, not necessarily for a word of hope, but for some concluding remarks. We are nearing the end of our conversation together, and I would like to give you the floor for that.
Yeah, thank you. This has been very rich discussion, and I'm sure we can go on for a long time. So time is our enemy in some ways. We have to come to the conclusion. But I think what you pointed out, this web of relationship, is the key. We live in a connected world, and I think this is the only future, is actually to improve this relationship. Despite all of the barriers and the differences we have. And again, I would argue that many of the differences are also a source of richness and resilience. And I think that's illustrated to the trade flows that we just talked about. I mean, Europe imports 60% of its energy. That is a huge dependence. So it's not surprising that energy security is top on the list, both for those who might be excluded because they cannot afford the energy prices, but also in general, security of supply is important to all of the countries. So we have many, many things in common. And at the same time, as for example, Europe decarbonizes and other parts of the world decarbonize, we have to make sure we don't generate new dependencies that cause the same frictions and problems as the current energy dependency. And I'm just thinking, in a very simple things, like copper, lithium, rare earths demands that you might need for the renewable energy sources as they increase. But there are also commonalities, and I believe that, for example, if Russia embarks on the decarbonization strategy as indicated, Russia could supply clean electricity and clean blue hydrogen by separating carbon from gas through the infrastructure that exists toward China and toward Europe. So there are opportunities, but I think I would like to come to one of the key notions that was mentioned, I think, by you, Irene, that I think we need common and shared targets despite all of our differences. I think this is really the key, that we have at least a part of the vision that's shared by all of us. I think what Velina mentioned is also the key for me, standards. We need to have agreed standards, otherwise we'll be working in the opposite directions. So I think there are some elements on which the global community can agree that would nudge us in the right direction. And I would also, at the end, would like to comment on one of the remarks in the chat. I'm afraid that everything we talked about, all of these really ambitious plans that are expressed by China, by Europe, by Russia, Japan, US, and many other countries, all of them will not stop the climate change. I just want to make sure that there is no misunderstandings. We are talking about stabilizing climate change. And I think the deep tragedy of the situation in which we are is that even if all of these plans succeed, and I think many have expressed doubts that this is possible, even if that's the case, climate will be stabilized only well after 2050. So it is, I think, something that we are leaving over to the next generation. So independently whether we manage or fail, climate will be changing for the next 30 to 40 years. So the question is whether
the question is how much, right?
That's right. The question is how much beyond, and whether beyond the middle of the century we can actually leave the planet safe for the next generation. So it is about the next generation. This is why it's not surprising that Fridays for Future is really concerned about current pressures on the Earth system, and that they might inherit the planet that will not be as in such a good health and so safe as it was when we took it over, our generation. So I would say that's my concluding word. I think it's in all of our interest to try to do as much, to be ambitious, and hopefully some of those goals will be achieved, because it's, I think, for the benefit of all, despite many differences that we all have as individuals, as regions, as nations of the world, as different stakeholders.
Thank you, Naki. That's a beautiful concluding comment from you. Alex, Velina, would you like to throw in a sentence of wisdom also from your side, please? Velina, perhaps, and then we'll let Alex have the last word.
Well, I like that. I like it a lot that we are actually concluding this session with positive remarks, with a sense of optimism, and as someone who has been actually looking at all of these systemic risks, specifically related to climate change, also to the ecosystems, and the link between ecosystems and socio-economic system, a kind of a interconnection that hasn't been realized by our decision makers and stakeholders to a great extent, and now is actually having such a huge impact on societies, politics, and economics. I think that through pain, rather than through actually active engagement, our stakeholders, no matter on which side of the Atlantic or the Pacific, will arrive at the very same conclusion, that they will need to collaborate, because there is currently no planet B. Now, this is my personal, of course, view. And let's think about how Big Tobacco, for instance, started actually launching initiatives which were making actually people aware of the risks, of the not just potential, the real risks. It started when the pain on the social system and on the health system increased immensely. And the same will happen, I think, with climate change. Once the pain coming from climate change related policies, not just on people, but collectively on societies, will put the necessary pressure on stakeholders. I'm very convinced about it. And we know that because of all the science that has been suppressed by big oil companies since the 1970s, and which is still very much relevant. It's the same science. We are in a don't look up moment. I just want to make a reference to this really great movie on Netflix, without spoilers. Now, when it comes to Russia, and when it comes to, I would say, Russia and China, which are very much realpolitik actors. These are actors that try, of course, to survive and navigate in a very insecure environment. We are currently in a kind of a bifurcation of the global system. It's a really insecure environment. I am afraid, of course, that Russia, and I will speak only of Russia, might decide that it should rather stick to its geopolitical calculations and will seek to benefit from the geopolitical advantages from not transitioning in the energy sector, trying to capitalize as much as possible on its oil sector and then moving to the gas sector. So this is actually my prognosis, at least for the next 10 to 20 years, where Russia is still actually expecting to gain a lot. And one of the really most important partnerships Moscow is eyeing is the one with China, because the expectation is that China will be further growing. And with that, of course, the energy demand of China will increase. And China is increasingly actually orienting itself towards Asia. So in a sense, we need to wait in both arguments. And of course, we need to be aware of the risks coming from both dimensions of this problem.
Thank you, Velina. Not such an optimistic twist on the questions, but we are here to be realistic as well. Alex, your last words of wisdom, please, for this round of a conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Irene. I don't know it's a wisdom also, but first of all, I agree with all my colleagues on this panel. And I still want to refer back to what I started. I think nothing's perfect. The cracks are where the lights come in. And in Chinese, we have a similar terminology says the challenges and the opportunities, most of the cases are interlinked with each other. Though, you know, it will be much nicer if, you know, the pandemic didn't occur. We can all meet at the Kreisky Forum face to face. The situation that we are able to have this 90 minutes very productive, engaging discussions, exchanging views from Europe to China to Russia and covering some other countries. We virtually, but we saved a lot of CO2 emission. So we should always keep a hope. And I think I'm the highest as we always these conventions, COPs, we setting a very high targets. I'm the highest. We should really work together the hardest. And as Professor Nakićenović alarmed us, regardless what we do, the climate is changing. So we should also prepare for the worst.
It's up to me to thank you all for your time, for your commitment to this dialogue, for the insights that you brought to this dialogue, for your willingness to listen to each other and to engage with each other. I think we had a rich conversation. I thank the Bruno Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue for hosting us. And I very much look forward to continuing this conversation in different configurations. I thank our public. I thank the support in the person of Jutta from the Bruno Kreisky Forum very much. And with that, I conclude our dialogue. Thank you very much and all the best.
Thank you.